The VA hospital reception desk fell silent as Michael Thompson's legs buckled beneath him, his winter coat splitting at the seams to reveal what no human back should ever carry. The basketball-sized mass protruding between his shoulder blades hit the linoleum floor with a sickening thud that echoed through the lobby like a death knell. It wasn't just another veteran seeking help, it was a walking nightmare that made seasoned nurses gasp and cover their mouths in horror, wheelchairs scattered as people stumbled backward, a child's juice box exploding against the wall in her mother's trembling grip. The security guard's radio clattered to the floor as his shaking hands failed him. An elderly woman in the corner whispered a desperate prayer, her knitting needles frozen mid-stitch. Martha Thompson had driven her husband here every Christmas season for 15 years, watching hope drain from his eyes with each rejection. Now she knelt beside him, her weathered hands hovering helplessly over the grotesque burden that had stolen their lives. "Code Blue to reception! We need specialists now!" The head nurse's voice cracked with urgency, her professional composure shattered by what she'd witnessed. What had the military done to this man? And how many others were suffering in silence? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The story of Michael Mick Thompson began in the summer of 1991 when a 19-year-old farm boy from Millfield, Ohio, raised his right hand and swore to defend his country. Back then, his shoulders were broad and straight, capable of hauling hay bales and fixing tractor engines with the same steady hands that would later tremble trying to button his specially tailored shirts. The Gulf War seemed like a noble calling: protect the innocent, serve with honor, come home a hero. 15 years later, that hero couldn't hug his 5-year-old granddaughter. Martha Thompson remembered the exact moment their lives changed forever. December 2009, Mick had rolled over in bed and winced, pressing his hand to a small lump between his shoulder blades. "Probably pulled something at the plant," he'd said, kissing her forehead before heading to his shift at the steel mill. That tiny bump, no bigger than a golf ball, would grow into the monster that now defined their existence. Their modest ranch house on Elm Street told the story of gradual surrender. The dining room table disappeared first, replaced by a medical recliner where Mick spent his nights sitting upright, the only position that didn't send shooting pain down his spine. Wedding photos gathered dust on shelves he could no longer reach. The American flag still flew proudly in their front yard, but inside, medical bills created mountains of debt that threatened to bury them alive. Martha had transformed from the cheerful third-grade teacher who baked cookies for school fundraisers into a woman who worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. Dawn shift at Murphy's Diner, afternoon cleaning offices downtown, evening stocking shelves at Walmart. Her hands, once soft from moisturizer and gentle with children's scraped knees, now bore the calluses of desperation. She'd learned to smile through exhaustion, to reassure Mick that everything would be fine while secretly calculating which bills could wait another month. Their daughter Sarah had escaped to Chicago, building a successful nursing career while watching her father's decline through stilted phone calls and awkward holiday visits. At 26, she carried the guilt of distance, sending money she couldn't afford while pursuing a life her parents had sacrificed everything to give her. Her own daughter, Emma, knew her grandfather as the man with the mountain on his back who told wonderful stories but couldn't pick her up for proper hugs. Winter in Ohio had always been harsh, but this December felt particularly cruel. The mass had grown so large that Mick's custom coats no longer fit properly, leaving gaps that let in bitter wind. Neighbors who once stopped by for coffee now crossed the street, uncertain how to face the Thompson family's visible suffering. The local VFW Post sent Christmas cards but avoided deeper involvement. Everyone knew about Mick's condition, but nobody knew what to say. 13 doctors had examined the growth over the years. 13 different verdicts of inoperable, too risky, or learn to live with it. Each consultation cost thousands they didn't have. Each rejection felt like another nail in the coffin of hope. The Millfield Elementary Christmas pageant had been a Thompson family tradition for decades. Martha had directed the annual production for 12 years before Mick's condition forced her into the workforce, and even now, watching little Emma practice Silent Night in their living room brought tears to her eyes. The 5-year-old's voice rang pure and sweet, her blonde curls bouncing as she swayed to the melody she'd inherited from her grandmother's musical genes. "Grandpa, you're coming to watch me sing, right?" Emma had asked the week before, her small hand resting on Mick's knee as he sat hunched in his recliner. The Mass had grown so large that winter that he resembled a medieval hunchback from the fairy tales Martha used to read to Sarah. But Emma saw only her beloved grandfather, the man who told her stories about brave soldiers and promised that good always triumphed over evil. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, sunshine," Mick had whispered, though Martha caught the doubt flickering in his eyes. The elementary school's cramped auditorium seats were designed for normal-sized adults, not men carrying basketball-sized burdens on their backs. December 15th arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made bones ache and old injuries flare. Martha had spent 40 minutes that morning helping Mick into his largest winter coat, the fabric straining across the grotesque bulge that had stolen her husband's dignity along with his health. They'd arrived early to claim seats in the back row, hoping to avoid the stares and whispered comments that followed them everywhere. The auditorium filled with proud parents and grandparents, everyone bundled in holiday sweaters and carrying phones to capture their children's performances. Martha watched families embrace and laugh together, remembering when such simple gestures hadn't required careful positioning and awkward accommodations. A young father lifted his toddler onto his shoulders for a better view, and Martha felt Mick's hand tighten around hers. Emma appeared on stage in her angel costume, white wings slightly crooked and a tinsel halo sliding down her forehead. She found her grandparents in the audience and waved enthusiastically, her face lighting up with pure joy. Mick tried to wave back, but the movement sent a sharp pain through his shoulders, and he could only manage a small gesture that probably looked more like a twitch to distant observers. The children began singing Silent Night, their voices creating that magical harmony that only emerges when innocence meets tradition. Emma's solo verse approached, and Martha felt her heart swell with pride despite their circumstances. This was what mattered: family, faith, and the simple miracles that reminded them why they kept fighting. But halfway through Emma's solo, the Mass shifted. Mick had learned to manage the constant discomfort, to breathe through the shooting pains and muscle spasms that accompanied his condition. But this was different, a sudden, violent movement inside the growth that felt like something breaking loose. He gasped, his hand flying to his back, and Martha turned toward him in alarm. "Mick, what's wrong?" He couldn't answer. The pain was unlike anything he'd experienced, radiating from the Mass down his spine and into his chest. The auditorium seemed to tilt sideways, Emma's voice fading into a distant echo as darkness crept in from the edges of his vision. He tried to stand, to get outside before making a scene, but his legs betrayed him. Michael Thompson, decorated Gulf War veteran and proud grandfather, collapsed during his granddaughter's Christmas solo. The crash echoed through the auditorium like thunder, instantly silencing the children's choir. Parents gasped and turned, some pulling out phones to call 911 while others rushed forward to help. Emma stopped singing mid-note, her small face crumpling as she saw her grandfather on the floor, the terrible mass visible now that his coat had split open at the seams. "Please, everyone stay back." Martha knelt beside her husband, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. She'd handled medical emergencies as a teacher, but this was different. This was the man she'd loved for 30 years. and she could see something had fundamentally changed in his condition. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but their professional confidence evaporated when they saw what they were dealing with. How do you transport a man whose back deformity makes standard positioning impossible? The stretcher couldn't accommodate the mass, and every movement caused Mick to cry out in agony, sounds that would haunt Martha's dreams for months afterward. "We need to get him to the VA hospital," the lead paramedic decided, though his uncertainty was obvious. "Ma'am, you'll need to follow us. We're not sure how this is going to work." As they loaded Mick into the ambulance using a specially configured transport chair, Martha caught sight of Emma being comforted by her teacher, the little girl's angel costume now wrinkled and her face streaked with tears. The pageant continued without them, but the joy had been sucked from the room like air from a punctured balloon. This was their breaking point, Martha realized as she followed the ambulance through the snowy streets of Millfield. 13 doctors had failed them, their savings were exhausted, and now even attending their granddaughter's school play had become impossible. Something had to change, or they would lose everything, including each other. The VA hospital's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Dr. Peterson's face as he delivered his verdict with the detached professionalism that had become achingly familiar to the Thompson family. "Mr. Thompson, I've reviewed your scans and consulted with my colleagues. This appears to be a complex benign lipoma, a fatty tumor. While impressive in size, surgical removal would pose unacceptable risks given your age and the mass's proximity to vital structures." Martha felt something inside her chest crack like ice on a winter pond. 13 doctors. 13 rejections. Each consultation had cost them thousands they didn't have. Each expert opinion, another shovelful of dirt on the grave of their hopes. She watched her husband's shoulders slump further, an almost impossible feat given the massive burden he already carried. "But doctor," Martha's voice carried the desperation of a woman who had sacrificed everything, "he can't live like this anymore. He collapsed at our granddaughter's Christmas pageant. He hasn't been able to lie down in 7 years. Surely there's something—" "Mrs. Thompson, I understand your frustration, but medical ethics prevent me from performing surgery that's more likely to kill your husband than help him." Dr. Peterson's tone suggested the conversation was over. "I recommend pain management and lifestyle modifications. There are support groups for families dealing with chronic conditions." The drive home through Millfield's snow-covered streets passed in crushing silence. Martha gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white, fighting back tears that had become her constant companion. Beside her, Mick stared out the passenger window at familiar houses decorated with Christmas lights, each twinkling bulb a reminder of the normal life that had been stolen from them. They arrived home to find a stack of mail that would have broken a weaker woman's spirit entirely. The insurance denial letter sat on top, a form letter explaining that Mr. Thompson's condition was deemed pre-existing and elective treatment despite 15 years of documented deterioration. Beneath it, the hospital bill from today's consultation, $4,847 for Dr. Peterson to spend 20 minutes telling them what they already knew. "Martha," Mick's voice was barely above a whisper as he settled into his recliner, the only piece of furniture in their house that accommodated his deformity. "Maybe it's time we faced facts. Maybe this is just how it's going to be." She whirled around, medical bills scattering from her hands like autumn leaves. "Don't you dare give up on me, Michael Thompson. Don't you dare!" But even as she spoke the words, Martha felt her own faith wavering. How much more could they endure? Their mortgage was 3 months behind, her 3 jobs barely covered basic expenses, and their daughter Sarah had already sacrificed too much trying to help them financially. The doorbell's chime cut through their despair like a lifeline thrown to drowning swimmers. Martha opened the door to find Mrs. Henderson from next door, holding a casserole dish. and wearing the carefully composed expression of someone bearing difficult news. "Martha, honey, I hope you don't mind me dropping by. I heard about what happened at the pageant." She stepped inside, glancing toward Mick with the mixture of pity and discomfort that had become their neighbor's default expression. "I brought some tuna casserole, and I wanted you to know that Harold and I have been talking. There's something you should know about a treatment option that might help." Martha accepted the casserole with trembling hands, hope and skepticism warring in her chest. How many times had well-meaning friends offered miracle cures, experimental treatments, or faith healers who promised what medical science couldn't deliver? "There's a clinic in Mexico," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "My sister's friend's nephew went there for a similar condition. It's not traditional medicine, but they had remarkable success. The costs are much lower than here, and they're willing to take cases that American doctors won't touch." As Mrs. Henderson left, Martha clutched the hastily scribbled contact information: Mexico, experimental treatment. The words should have filled her with hope, but instead she felt the familiar weight of impossible choices. How could they afford to travel internationally when they couldn't afford their grocery bills? How could they trust foreign doctors when American specialists had failed them? That evening, as snow continued to fall outside their kitchen window, Martha spread their financial documents across the table like a general planning a final, desperate battle. Their house, the modest ranch where they'd raised Sarah, where they'd planned to grow old together, had accumulated enough equity over the years to possibly fund one last medical gamble. The phone rang at 9:47 p.m., jarring them both from exhausted silence. Unknown number, which usually meant bill collectors or automated medical appointment reminders. Martha almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up on the fourth ring. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Dr. James Harrison. I'm a retired Army surgeon, and I've been following your husband's case through some mutual contacts at the VA. I served in the Gulf War myself, and I believe I might be able to help." The voice was calm, professional, with the slight southern drawl that reminded Martha of her own father. But there was something else in his tone, an urgency that the other doctors had lacked, as if Michael Thompson's case represented more than just another medical challenge. "Dr. Harrison, I don't understand. How did you hear about my husband? We haven't contacted any other doctors." "Mrs. Thompson, I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Are you available tomorrow afternoon? I'm driving up from Cincinnati, and I think what I have to tell you might change everything." As Martha hung up the phone, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: genuine hope. But beneath that hope lurked a deeper question that would soon unravel everything they thought they knew about Michael's condition. Why would a retired Army surgeon drive 3 hours to examine a patient he'd never met? Dr. James Harrison arrived at the Thompson house on December 18th, driving a modest Honda Civic that seemed incongruous with his distinguished bearing. Martha watched from the kitchen window as he stepped out of the car, noting the military precision in his movements despite his civilian clothes. He was tall and lean, probably in his late 50s, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent making life-and-death decisions. "Mrs. Thompson, thank you for agreeing to see me on such short notice." His handshake was firm, his eyes kind but penetrating as they took in the carefully arranged living room that had been modified to accommodate Mick's condition. The medical recliner dominated the space like a monument to suffering, surrounded by heating pads, prescription bottles, and the accumulated detritus of chronic pain management. Mick struggled to rise from his chair, a process that now took considerable effort and caused visible discomfort. Harrison immediately gestured for him to remain seated. "Please, Mr. Thompson, don't trouble yourself. I've seen enough medical examinations to know that comfort should be our first priority." Something in the doctor's tone suggested he understood their situation in ways that went beyond textbook knowledge. Martha found herself studying his face, searching for clues about his true motivations. Why had he really come? What did he hope to accomplish that 13 other specialists had failed to achieve? "Dr. Harrison," Martha began carefully, "I have to ask, why are you here? We've been told repeatedly that Michael's condition is inoperable, that the risks outweigh any potential benefits. What makes you think you can help when so many others have given up?" Harrison settled into the chair across from them, his expression growing grave. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to be direct with you because I believe you deserve the truth. Your husband's case was brought to my attention through channels that most civilian doctors don't have access to. I've spent the last 15 years tracking similar cases among Gulf War veterans, and what I've discovered has convinced me that we're dealing with something far more complex than simple lipomas." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Martha felt her heart rate accelerate, while Mick leaned forward despite the pain it caused. This was the first time any medical professional had suggested that his condition might be connected to his military service. "What do you mean, similar cases?" Mick's voice carried a mixture of hope and dread. "Are you saying other veterans have developed masses like mine?" "More than you might imagine," Harrison replied, opening a briefcase and extracting a thick folder. "I've documented 47 cases of unusual growth patterns among Gulf War veterans, concentrated primarily among personnel who served in specific operational areas. The Pentagon has been remarkably unhelpful in providing data, but independent research has revealed disturbing patterns." Martha's hands began to tremble as she accepted the folder. Inside were medical photographs that made her stomach turn. Images of men and women bearing grotesque masses similar to Michael's, along with detailed case studies documenting their struggles with an indifferent medical establishment. "These people," she whispered, "what happened to them?" "Some died waiting for treatment. Others underwent experimental procedures that failed catastrophically. A few found doctors willing to operate despite the risks with mixed results." Harrison's voice carried the weight of professional failure and personal anguish. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to tell you something that may be difficult to hear. I believe your husband and these other veterans were exposed to toxic materials during their service, and their bodies have been fighting a slow-motion poisoning for decades." The room fell silent except for the ticking of Martha's grandmother's clock and the labored sound of Mick's breathing. Outside, snow continued to fall on their quiet street, insulating them from a world that had moved on while they remained trapped in this medical nightmare. "Dr. Harrison," Mick said finally, "if what you're suggesting is true, why hasn't the VA acknowledged this? Why have all these doctors refused to help us?" Harrison's expression darkened. "Because acknowledging the connection would open the floodgates to massive litigation. We're talking about potentially thousands of veterans who might have been exposed to the same contaminants. The financial liability alone would be staggering, not to mention the political implications." Martha felt anger building in her chest like a wildfire. "So they've just abandoned these men and women, left them to suffer in silence while covering up the truth? I'm afraid the evidence suggests exactly that." Harrison pulled out additional documents, including correspondence with VA administrators and Pentagon officials. "Mrs. Thompson, I need you to understand something. If I agree to operate on your husband, we're not just fighting his medical condition. We're challenging a system that has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo." The implications were staggering. Martha thought of all the doors that had been slammed in their faces, all the doctors who had dismissed Michael's case with barely concealed irritation. Had they known? Had they been deliberately avoiding cases that might implicate the military in veteran health problems? "What would the surgery involve?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "I would need to perform extensive imaging first, using equipment specifically designed to detect metallic fragments and chemical residues. If my suspicions are correct, the mass isn't just fatty tissue. It's your husband's body attempting to encapsulate and neutralize foreign contaminants." Harrison leaned forward, his expression intense. "The surgery would be extraordinarily complex, requiring a team of specialists and several hours in the operating room. The risks are significant, but I believe they're manageable with proper preparation." Mick reached for Martha's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had sustained them through 3 decades of marriage. "What aren't you telling us, Doc? There's something else, isn't there?" Harrison's pause stretched long enough for Martha to count her own heartbeats. When he finally spoke, his words would haunt her dreams for months to come. "Mr. Thompson, if I'm right about the nature of your condition, the surgery will likely reveal evidence of what you were exposed to during your service. That evidence could be crucial in helping other veterans receive the care they deserve, but it would also make you a target for people who prefer that this information never sees the light of day." The weight of his words settled over them like a burial shroud. They weren't just fighting for Michael's health anymore. They were potentially becoming whistleblowers in a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and military leadership. "Doctor," Martha said quietly, "what happened to the other veterans who tried to expose this? Some were discredited. Others faced legal challenges that bankrupted them. A few simply disappeared from public view." Harrison's tone was matter-of-fact, but his eyes betrayed deep concern. "I won't lie to you. Pursuing this path could put your family at risk in ways that go beyond medical complications." Martha looked at her husband, seeing the man she'd fallen in love with beneath the physical burden that had nearly destroyed them both. She thought of Sarah, working herself to exhaustion in Chicago while sending money they needed for their own bills. She thought of little Emma, asking why Grandpa couldn't pick her up anymore. "Dr. Harrison," she said finally, "if we don't do this, Michael dies slowly, while the system pretends nothing is wrong. If we do proceed, at least we have a chance to save him and maybe help other families avoid what we've gone through." Mick squeezed her hand. "Martha's right. I didn't serve my country to come home and die in silence while other veterans suffer the same fate. If there's a chance to make this right, we have to take it." Harrison nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "I'll need 48 hours to assemble the surgical team and arrange for the specialized equipment. Mrs. Thompson, I strongly recommend that you contact your daughter and have her come home. Whatever we discover during this surgery, your family is going to need each other more than ever." As Dr. Harrison prepared to leave, he turned back to them with one final warning. "The next few days are going to test everything you believe about your government, your medical system, and your own strength as a family. But I want you to know that you're not fighting this battle alone anymore." After he left, Martha and Mick sat in silence, holding hands while snow continued to fall outside their window. The comfortable illusions that had sustained them through 15 years of medical frustration had been shattered, replaced by a truth that was both terrifying and liberating. Tomorrow, they would begin a journey that might save Michael's life or destroy everything they had left to lose. The call to Sarah came at 6:47 a.m. on December 19th while she was preparing for her shift at Chicago Children's Hospital. Martha's voice carried an urgency that immediately sent adrenaline coursing through her daughter's veins. "Sarah, you need to come home. Your father is having surgery in 3 days." "Surgery? Mom, what are you talking about? Last week you said Dr. Peterson refused to operate." Sarah sank onto her apartment's worn couch, her nursing uniform half-buttoned as she processed this impossible news. "A new doctor contacted us. A military surgeon named Dr. Harrison. Sarah, there are things about your father's condition that we never knew, things that might involve his service in the Gulf War." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was prepared to cross. Sarah had spent years encouraging her parents to accept Michael's condition, to focus on quality of life rather than chasing impossible cures. She'd watched them drain their savings pursuing treatments that offered nothing but false hope and financial ruin. "Mom, please tell me you're not falling for another scam. Remember the clinic in Mexico? The experimental treatments that cost us $15,000? I can't watch you go through that again." Martha's voice hardened with a resolve Sarah hadn't heard in years. "This is different. Dr. Harrison showed us files on dozens of other Gulf War veterans with similar conditions. Sarah, your father wasn't just unlucky. He was poisoned serving his country, and the government has been covering it up for decades." The accusation struck Sarah like a physical blow. As a medical professional, she understood the complexities of military medicine and government bureaucracy, but the conspiracy her mother was describing seemed too vast, too deliberately malicious to be credible. "Mom, even if that's true, why would this Dr. Harrison risk his career to help Dad? What's in it for him?" The pause on the other end of the line stretched long enough for Sarah to hear her own heart pounding. When Martha finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "His brother died in the Gulf War, Sarah. In your father's arms." The revelation hit Sarah like a sledgehammer to the chest. She'd heard her father's war stories countless times, including the terrible night when his best friend Jimmy Kowalski had died from injuries sustained in a tank explosion. Michael had carried that guilt for over 3 decades, often waking from nightmares where he failed to save his buddy. "Jesus, Mom, you're saying this doctor is Jimmy's brother?" Dr. James Harrison became a military surgeon specifically to investigate what happened to Jimmy and other Gulf War casualties. He's been tracking cases like your father's for 15 years, building evidence of systematic exposure to toxic materials. Sarah's medical training warred with her emotional response. The rational part of her mind cataloged the impossibilities. The coincidence of Jimmy's brother finding them, the conspiracy theory implications, the surgical risks involved in operating on a mass that size. But the daughter in her recognized something she hadn't heard from her mother in years: genuine hope backed by concrete action. "What aren't you telling me, Mom?" Another pause, longer this time. "The surgery could kill him, Sarah. Dr. Harrison was very clear about the risks. But if we do nothing, your father will die anyway, slowly, painfully, while watching his family destroy themselves trying to save him." Sarah closed her eyes, seeing her father as he'd been during her childhood. Strong, laughing, lifting her onto his shoulders to watch 4th of July fireworks, the man who'd taught her to ride a bike, to stand up for herself, to believe that good always triumphed over evil. That man had been disappearing piece by piece for 15 years, replaced by someone hunched and broken, carrying a burden that had stolen his dignity along with his health. "I'll be there tonight," she said finally. "But Mom, we need to talk about what happens if this goes wrong. Emma needs to be protected from—" "Your daughter will not grow up thinking her grandfather gave up without a fight," Martha interrupted, her voice fierce with maternal determination. "And she won't grow up in a world where veterans are abandoned by the system they served." Sarah hung up and immediately called her supervisor to request emergency family leave. As she threw clothes into a suitcase, her hands shook with a mixture of fear and anger. If Dr. Harrison was telling the truth, her father had been failed not just by 13 individual doctors, but by an entire system designed to protect the people who protected America. The drive from Chicago to Millfield took 4.5 hours through increasingly heavy snow. Sarah used the time to research Dr. James Harrison, finding an impressive military record and subsequent civilian career specializing in combat-related injuries. His published papers included several references to Gulf War syndrome and toxic exposure among veterans, lending credibility to his claims about systematic cover-ups. She arrived at her childhood home to find it transformed into a command center for medical preparation. Her mother had compiled years of medical records, insurance documents, and correspondence with various doctors into neat folders. Her father sat in his recliner, looking smaller somehow. as if the weight of impending surgery had compressed him further. "Sarah?" His voice cracked when he saw her, and for the first time in months she saw tears in his eyes. "I know this is crazy. I know the odds are against us. But I can't keep living like this, watching your mother work herself to death while I sit here feeling sorry for myself." She knelt beside his chair, carefully positioning herself to avoid the massive growth that had become the family's unwelcome third resident. "Dad, I need you to understand something. If we're doing this, we're doing it together. No more secrets, no more protecting each other from bad news. We face whatever comes as a family." That evening, Dr. Harrison returned with a portable ultrasound machine and additional equipment Sarah didn't recognize. She watched him examine her father with the focused intensity of a craftsman studying his most challenging project. His findings confirmed what the family had feared and hoped in equal measure. "The mass contained significant metallic density consistent with foreign material," he announced after completing his examination. "Mr. Thompson, I'm now certain that your body has been fighting a slow-motion poisoning for over 3 decades. The surgery will be our attempt to remove not just the growth, but the toxic materials your body has been trying to encapsulate." As Sarah helped prepare her father for preoperative procedures, she noticed Dr. Harrison pull her mother aside for a private conversation. Through the kitchen window, she could see them speaking in hushed tones, Martha's face growing increasingly pale, as Harrison shared information he hadn't revealed during his initial visit. When her mother returned, Sarah could see that something fundamental had changed in her expression, a hardening that spoke of difficult truths and dangerous knowledge. "Mom, what did he tell you?" Martha glanced toward the living room where Michael was resting, then back to her daughter. "Sarah, there are people who don't want this surgery to succeed. Dr. Harrison has received warnings to abandon your father's case. We may not be dealing just with medical complications." The weight of that revelation settled over Sarah like a funeral shroud. They weren't just fighting for her father's life anymore. They were potentially declaring war on forces that had the power to destroy them all. December 22nd arrived with the kind of bone-deep cold that made the entire world feel brittle and unforgiving. Sarah had barely slept, listening to her father's labored breathing from the next room and wondering if this would be their last night together as a complete family. The preoperative instructions had been extensive: no food or water after midnight, specialized positioning requirements for transport, and emergency contacts for what Dr. Harrison euphemistically called unexpected complications. The drive to Cincinnati General Hospital took place in heavy silence, broken only by Martha's quiet prayers and the rhythmic sound of windshield wipers fighting the morning snow. Sarah drove while her mother sat in the back seat with Michael, holding his hand and whispering reassurances that sounded more like desperate mantras than genuine comfort. "Whatever happens today," Michael said as they pulled into the hospital parking garage, "I want you both to know that I'm grateful. Grateful for 30 years with the most beautiful woman in Ohio. Grateful for raising a daughter who became everything we dreamed she could be. If this is where my story ends, at least it ends with me fighting instead of just fading away." Sarah's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her face as she helped her father from the car. The man who had once seemed invincible, who had survived combat and 20 years in a steel mill, now needed assistance walking 50 yards to the hospital entrance. The injustice of it burned in her chest like acid. Dr. Harrison met them at the surgical unit, accompanied by a team that included 2 other surgeons, an anesthesiologist, and several nurses. Sarah immediately noticed the unusual security measures: additional personnel she didn't recognize, cameras in positions that seemed designed to monitor rather than assist, and a tension among the staff that went beyond normal pre-operative anxiety. "Mr. Thompson, I want to review what we discussed yesterday," Dr. Harrison said as they prepared Michael for surgery. This procedure will likely take 8 to 10 hours. We'll be removing the mass in sections while carefully cataloging any foreign materials we discover. Your family should prepare for the possibility that what we find might raise more questions than it answers. As they wheeled Michael toward the operating room, he caught Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "Sarah, promise me something. If this goes wrong, don't let them bury the truth with me. Other families are going through what we've been through. Make sure they get the help we couldn't find." The operating room doors closed with a finality that echoed through Sarah's soul like the sound of a coffin lid. She and Martha settled into the surgical waiting area, joining the grim fellowship of families whose lives hung in the balance of medical intervention. Hours stretched ahead of them like an endless highway leading into darkness. At 11:30 a.m., Dr. Harrison emerged for the first time, his surgical scrubs already stained with evidence of the complex procedure underway. His expression was troubled as he approached the Thompson women. "We've encountered something unexpected," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "The mass contains significantly more foreign material than anticipated. We're finding metallic fragments, chemical residues, and tissue changes that suggest long-term toxic exposure on a scale I've never seen before." Martha gripped Sarah's arm with desperate intensity. "What does that mean for Michael?" "It means your husband's body has been fighting a war for 30 years, trying to contain materials that should never have been inside a human being. We're documenting everything. But Mrs. Thompson, I need you to understand, what we're discovering could have significant implications beyond your husband's individual case." As Dr. Harrison returned to surgery, Sarah noticed new arrivals in the waiting area, men in suits who didn't look like family members or hospital staff. They positioned themselves strategically around the room, their presence creating an atmosphere of surveillance that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Mom," she whispered, "I think we're being watched." Martha had noticed them too, her teacher's instincts recognizing the difference between concerned relatives and something more sinister. "Dr. Harrison warned me this might happen. There are people who don't want Michael's case to become public knowledge." The afternoon wore on with agonizing slowness. Sarah found herself cataloging the faces around them, noting how the suited men seemed to take turns monitoring the surgical updates and making quiet phone calls in the corridor. Whatever her father's surgery was revealing, it was clearly making powerful people very uncomfortable. At 4:17 p.m., a commotion near the operating room doors sent waves of anxiety through the waiting area. Sarah could see medical personnel moving with urgent purpose, equipment being rushed into surgery, and Dr. Harrison's team expanding to include specialists she hadn't seen before. "Code blue or 7, code blue or 7. The announcement over the hospital's intercom system hit Martha like a physical blow. She doubled over in her chair, 20 years of suppressed fear and anguish pouring out in broken sobs that echoed off the sterile walls. Sarah held her mother while her own world collapsed around them. After 15 years of gradual decline, after finding hope in Dr. Harrison's intervention, after believing they might finally reclaim their lives from this medical nightmare, they were about to lose everything that mattered in a single afternoon. The man who had raised her, who had served his country with honor, who had never complained despite carrying an impossible burden, was dying on an operating table while strangers watched from the shadows. The code blue alarm fell silent after what felt like an eternity, leaving the surgical waiting area wrapped in a suffocating quiet that made every heartbeat audible. Sarah held her mother's trembling form while watching the suited men exchange glances and speak into their phones with increased urgency. Whatever was happening in Operating Room 7 had clearly exceeded everyone's expectations. Dr. Harrison emerged at 6:45 p.m., his surgical mask pulled down to reveal a face etched with exhaustion and something that looked remarkably like awe. His scrubs were heavily stained, and Sarah noticed his hands shaking slightly as he approached them. Not the tremor of fatigue, but the involuntary response of someone who had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of the possible. "Mrs. Thompson, Sarah, your husband is stable." The code blue was called when we discovered something that required additional expertise and equipment. He sat down heavily in the chair across from them, suddenly looking every one of his 58 years. "What we found inside that mass is going to change everything we thought we knew about Gulf War syndrome and toxic exposure among veterans." Martha wiped her tears with the back of her hand, steel replacing vulnerability in her voice. "Dr. Harrison, please just tell us the truth. Whatever it is, we can handle it." The mass contained 14 pounds of encapsulated material, metallic fragments, chemical compounds, and tissue that had been systematically isolated by your husband's immune system over 3 decades. But that's not the shocking part. Harrison paused, glancing toward the men in suits who had moved closer to their conversation. "Mrs. Thompson, we also found human remains." The words hit Sarah like ice water injected directly into her veins. "Human remains? What do you mean?" "Dog tags, bone fragments, and tissue samples that don't belong to your husband. Mrs. Thompson, when Michael tried to save his friend Jimmy Kowalski in 1991, he didn't just absorb toxic materials from the explosion, he literally absorbed parts of his dying friend. His body has been preserving Jimmy's remains for 32 years. Martha's hand flew to her mouth, a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob escaping her lips. Sarah felt the world tilt sideways as the implications crashed over her like a tsunami. Her father hadn't just been carrying a medical burden, he'd been carrying his best friend's corpse, his body acting as a living grave for a fallen soldier. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered, her medical training rebelling against such a scenario. "Bodies don't work that way. You can't just absorb foreign organic material and have it survive inside you for decades. Under normal circumstances, you'd be absolutely right. But the toxic exposure your father experienced created conditions that were far from normal. The chemical compounds essentially mummified the foreign organic matter, while his immune system built increasingly complex barriers around it." Harrison's voice carried the weight of a man describing the impossible made manifest. "Sarah, in 30 years of military medicine, I've never seen anything like what we found in your father's body." One of the suited men stepped forward, his movement casual but clearly intentional. "Dr. Harrison, I think this conversation might be better continued in a more private setting. There are security considerations that—" "Security considerations?" Martha's voice cut through the man's diplomatic tone like a knife through tissue paper. "My husband nearly died today carrying the remains of a soldier who's been listed as missing in action for over 30 years, and you're worried about security?" The man's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught the subtle hand signal he made to his colleagues. More personnel were moving into position around the waiting area, creating what looked suspiciously like a containment perimeter. "Ma'am, I understand your distress, but there are national security implications to consider. The materials recovered during your husband's surgery contain sensitive information that could compromise ongoing operations and put other service members at risk." Sarah felt her anger building to volcanic proportions. "Other service members? What about the service members who are already at risk? What about the veterans who've been suffering for decades while people like you covered up the truth?" "Doctor." Harrison stood slowly, his exhaustion replaced by something that looked like determination mixed with desperation. "Mrs. Thompson, Sarah, there's something else you need to know. The tissue samples we recovered included Jimmy Kowalski's identification tags, but they also contained documentation, papers that Jimmy had apparently hidden on his person before the explosion." "What kind of documentation?" Martha asked, though Sarah could see in her mother's eyes that she already suspected the answer would be devastating. Orders, chemical inventory sheets, and correspondence indicating that Jimmy and other soldiers in his unit had been deliberately exposed to experimental compounds as part of an undisclosed military research program. Mrs. Thompson, your husband and his friend weren't random casualties of war, they were test subjects. The revelation hit the waiting area like a bomb detonation. Martha collapsed back into her chair as if her strings had been cut, while Sarah felt 30 years of her father's suffering recontextualize itself into something far more sinister than medical misfortune. The men in suits were no longer pretending to be casual observers. They had moved into an obviously defensive formation around the family. "That's classified information," the lead agent said, his diplomatic veneer finally cracking to reveal the steel beneath. "Dr. Harrison, you're in violation of federal statutes by discussing details of classified military operations with civilian personnel." "Civilian personnel?" Sarah's voice cracked with fury. "These civilian personnel have spent 15 years and their life savings trying to get help for a condition that you people caused. My father is lying in a recovery room right now because your experimental program turned him into a living tomb for his best friend." The confrontation was interrupted by a commotion near the operating room doors. Michael Thompson was being wheeled out on a specialized gurney, his back heavily bandaged, but noticeably, miraculously flatter than it had been in 15 years. For the first time since Sarah was 11 years old, her father looked like a normal human being rather than a walking medical nightmare. Martha rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face as she saw her husband's profile without the grotesque bulge that had defined their existence for so long. "Michael, oh my God. Michael, you look like yourself again." His eyes fluttered open, still cloudy from anesthesia but focusing on his wife's face with an expression of wonder. "Martha? Did it work? Is it gone?" "It's gone, baby. It's finally gone." But even as Martha spoke the words of celebration, Sarah could see Dr. Harrison and the federal agents engaged in an increasingly heated discussion about evidence custody and information containment. Michael's recovery was interrupted by the arrival of additional personnel, military officials, legal representatives, and what appeared to be a damage control team designed to manage situations exactly like this one. The surgical waiting area had transformed from a place of healing into a battlefield where the Thompson family found themselves caught between medical miracle and political catastrophe. "Mrs. Thompson," the lead agent said, his tone now openly threatening, "I need you to understand that discussing the details of your husband's surgery with anyone outside this room could be considered an act of treason. The materials recovered during the procedure are classified at the highest levels of national security." Sarah stepped between the agent and her parents, her exhaustion and fear crystallizing into protective fury. "Are you seriously threatening my family with treason charges because my father's body preserved evidence of your war crimes? Are you that desperate to cover up what you did to our soldiers?" "Sarah, please," Dr. Harrison interjected, but his words carried a warning rather than reassurance. "These people have the authority to make this entire situation disappear, along with anyone who might complicate their narrative." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The Thompson family had won their medical battle. Michael would recover, the mass was gone, and he might actually have years of normal life ahead of him. But in saving his life, they had uncovered evidence of systematic abuse that powerful people would kill to protect. As they prepared to transfer Michael to a recovery room, Sarah realized that their nightmare wasn't ending. It was transforming into something far more dangerous than medical bills and insurance denials. They now possessed information that could topple careers, trigger congressional investigations, and expose decades of military cover-ups. The question was no longer whether Michael would survive his surgery, but whether any of them would survive what came next. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the rose garden of the White House, watching her father shake hands with the President of the United States. The man who had once been unable to hug his granddaughter now stood tall and straight, his military bearing restored along with his dignity. The massive settlement check in his jacket pocket represented not just financial compensation, but vindication for 32 years of suffering and systemic abandonment. The journey from that terrifying night in the hospital to this moment of triumph had been fraught with dangers none of them could have imagined. The federal agents who had threatened them in the surgical waiting area had underestimated the power of truth when wielded by determined people who had already lost everything they were afraid to lose. Dr. Harrison had become more than Michael's surgeon. He had become the family's advocate and protector, using his military connections and medical credentials to ensure that the evidence recovered during the operation reached the right people in Congress and the media. The documents found, preserved in Jimmy Kowalski's remains, had provided the smoking gun that investigators had been seeking for decades, proving systematic toxic exposure experiments conducted on unwitting American soldiers. Martha stood beside her husband, wearing the same blue dress she had worn to their wedding 30 years earlier. But now it fit her properly again. The stress weight she had carried for 15 years had melted away along with the family's financial burdens. Her teaching position had been restored with full tenure, and she had become a national advocate for military families facing medical crises. "Ladies and gentlemen," the President announced to the assembled crowd of reporters, veterans advocates, and congressional representatives, "today we right a historic wrong. The Gulf War Veterans Compensation Act, inspired by the courage of the Thompson family and hundreds of other military families, ensures that no veteran will ever again be abandoned by the system they serve to protect." Emma, now 6 years old and wearing her best dress, tugged on her grandfather's hand. "Grandpa, are you famous now?" Michael knelt down to her level, something he couldn't have done 6 months earlier, and smiled with the kind of joy that comes from surviving the impossible. "No, sunshine. We're just a family that didn't give up on each other." The ceremony concluded with the presentation of the first compensation checks to affected veterans and their families. Michael's settlement of $2.3 million would cover their medical expenses, restore their lost savings, and provide security for the rest of their lives. But more importantly, it represented acknowledgement from the highest levels of government that his suffering had been real, caused by his service, and worthy of recognition. Dr. Harrison, who had been awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his role in exposing the cover-up, approached the family as they prepared to leave. "Michael, I have something for you." He handed over a small wooden box containing Jimmy Kowalski's dog tags, now cleaned and polished to their original shine. "Jimmy's family wanted you to have these," Harrison explained, his voice thick with emotion. "They said that after carrying their son for 32 years, you've earned the right to decide where he finally rests." Michael accepted the box with trembling hands, tears streaming down his face as he felt the weight of his friend's tags. "All these years I thought I failed him. I thought I let him die." "You didn't let him die, Michael. You carried him home." The flight back to Ohio was filled with a peace the Thompson family hadn't experienced in decades. Martha held her husband's hand while Sarah pointed out landmarks to Emma, who was making plans for all the things she wanted to do with her fully mobile grandfather. Simple things: fishing, building snowmen, teaching her to ride a bike, activities that had been impossible for 15 years. Their modest ranch house on Elm Street looked exactly the same, but everything about their lives had fundamentally changed. The medical recliner that had dominated their living room for so long had been replaced with a comfortable couch where the whole family could sit together. The stacks of medical bills had been replaced with college fund statements for Emma and retirement plans that were actually achievable. Most importantly, Michael Thompson could finally lie down in his own bed next to his wife, without pain or fear or the crushing weight of an impossible burden. On Christmas morning, 1 year after his collapse at Emma's pageant, he woke up to find his granddaughter curled up next to him, her small hand resting on his chest where she could feel his strong, steady heartbeat. "Grandpa," Emma whispered, "I dreamed that angels took away your mountain." Michael smiled, thinking of Jimmy Kowalski and the impossible journey that had brought them all home. Maybe they did, sunshine. Maybe they finally did. Outside their window, snow fell gently on the American flag that still flew proudly in their front yard, a symbol not just of the country they had served, but of the justice they had fought so hard to achieve. Michael Thompson's story reminds us that behind every veteran's struggle lies a family that refuses to give up, and sometimes the greatest victories come after the darkest moments. For 32 years, this decorated Gulf War hero carried more than just physical pain. He carried the weight of a system that had forgotten its promise to those who served. His wife, Martha, worked 3 jobs while watching the man she loved disappear beneath an impossible burden. Their daughter, Sarah, sacrificed her own dreams to support parents who were drowning in medical debt and bureaucratic indifference. Yet through it all, they held on to something more powerful than any government program or insurance policy. They held on to each other. When Michael finally received the surgery that saved his life and exposed the truth that helped thousands of other veterans, it wasn't just medical technology that healed him. It was the love of a family who never stopped believing that justice was possible, even when the world seemed determined to prove them wrong. Today, Michael can hug his granddaughter, sleep in his own bed, and know that his suffering wasn't in vain. It became the key that unlocked hope for countless other military families. What family challenge have you overcome that made you stronger? Have you ever felt abandoned by a system you trusted, and how did you find the courage to keep fighting? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.